Well, this module is geared toward helping you to get a better understanding of the plant kingdom. And uh, the first chapter sets out to introduce you to plants, but also introduce you to the most primitive plants that we find, and those are the non-vascular plants, the bryophytes, generally called. And then we walk into the primitive vascular plants, the ferns and the fern allies. And then we see some of the seed plants, starting with the gymnosperms. Those are the non-flowering seed plants. And those include conifers and firs and those kinds of things. And then also the flowering plants. The last chapter sort of winds up with the flowering plants, the most recently evolved plant group within the kingdom. So I'm very comfortable with the green foliage that surrounds me. My background is in botany. Specifically, it is really in phycology, which is the study of algae, but I've spent a lot of time studying plants, taking systematic classes, also worked in lichenology to some degree. Lichenology is really outside the plant kingdom, but lichens, as we've mentioned before when we studied fungi, was that symbiotic relationship that occurs with a fungal partner and an algal partner, and it makes a very plant-like kind of structure. Most of the lichens that we observed commonly are growing on the bark of trees, and you can see even on this tree behind me there is lichenized growth on that, and you can see the discoloration on these various trunks. You can see lichens growing. They look a whole lot like a non-vascular plant, such as these two different species of moss I have here. This one right here, you can see reproductive structures relatively easy. You can see those little red hair-like structures. That represents a sporophyte, which we'll get into in just a second. But what I'm going to do, and basically just view this like as like a talking lab. I have all kinds of stuff in front of me to make mention of as we run through this. What I really want to stress, and what I want you to study in the lab manual, and once again I'm assuming most of you are working out of this manual right here or some version of this manual. Now this is the manual in its complete form, and it includes many more chapters than what you probably have in your manual, but it is this author and this type of manual that we're working out of. So I'm starting in my manual on chapter 16, non-vascular plants and seedless vascular plants. So a non-vascular plant includes, like I mentioned, the moss, the bryophytes, and there's several different phyla that are considered non-vascular plants. Those would be the hornworts and liverworts, and there's not quite as many representatives in those particular phyla. But in the phylum Bryophyta, which includes the true mosses, we have tons of different species, and even new species, especially in the tropics, places like that, and some of the more remote regions of our world. We find new species from time to time, so this is still a growing field of discovery. With the non-vascular plants, the vegetative body is described as a gametophyte. The gametophyte is much less specialized than, say, a fern or a gymnosperm like a pine tree or a flowering plant. And I say less specialized, and that there's no true roots and no true leaves. It's a vegetative type of growth, and the green vegetative plant that you see, it's described as a gametophyte. The gametophytic generation is haploid. I call it a generation, and with all the plants that lie before me, all the plants that surround me, they all undergo the same type of life history. And with all living organisms on this planet that are eukaryotic, that undergo a form of sexual reproduction, they exhibit a particular type of life history. With fungi, the type of life history that was observed or is observed is a zygotic type of life history. With plants, the type of life history that we observe is called a sporic life history, or as it's put in the lab manual, an alternation of generations. And in this case, we have in the case with all the plants, we have two separate generations, two separate multicellular generations. All plants are multicellular. And so there are two separate generations: a haploid generation, in which each cell only contains one type of each chromosome, and a diploid generation where you have sets or pairs of each type of chromosome. For example, in our bodies, each one of our cells, with the exception of some cells at maturity, such as red blood cells, in each of our somatic or body cells, there are sets of each type of chromosome. We have 23 chromosomal types, therefore there are 46 chromosomes in each of our cells, with the exception of gametic cells, sperm and egg. Those cells only have one of each particular type, and that's the haploid condition, the 1N condition versus a 2N condition. Well, with this tissue that we see here, the green tissue anyways, all the green leafy growth, that is gametophytic tissue. And within the gametophyte, make sure you look in the lab manual as you look over these life cycles, in the gametophytic tissue, this is where the male and female reproductive structures are formed, and the male reproductive structure regarding moss is called antheridia, and the female reproductive structure is called the archegonia. It's within the archegonia where eggs form, and it is within the antheridia where sperm form. It takes water. Water is a requirement for reproduction to occur among moss. And when we look at a moss plant, sort of think as, this is the whole plant, but that's not really the case. The plant is an individual, either male or female. It's about that big. Very, 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 very small. That's a single plant. And I'd have to use a microscope to determine if this was a male or if this was a female plant. But that's a single gametophyte. The plant tissue here is haploid. It is near the tip where there's archegonia or antheridia that produce either sperm or eggs. And here you can see with this one, many plants there, but there are these spike-like structures. You can see, and I know many of us have seen moss plants before, but you can see all these little teeny spike-like structures. They're like a stalk, and I'll use this stick as an example. So the little stalk rises up. What that represents is a zygote. A zygote is, or sporophyte, it's a product of a zygote. What a zygote does, when sperm and egg fuse within the female archegonium, a zygote forms. It's diploid. That zygote undergoes mitotic cellular divisions and grows and grows and grows. At the tip of that sporophyte that's diploid is a capsule in the case of moss. That capsule has cells that are specialized that undergo meiosis, a reduction division, to produce spores, haploid spores, that are released into the environment, usually close lying around the moss, but the wind can pick up the spores and take them for miles, hundreds of miles, if not thousands of miles. So the spores are the disseminule. They are the disseminating agent, and the spores land wherever. If it lands in a place that's conducive for growth, those spores will germinate. When they germinate back into a gametophyte that is haploid and multicellular. So you have two multicellular stages, the sporophyte and the gametophyte. And that quickly sort of covers the reproductive stages of moss and some of the various structures. Remember, moss is a non-vascular plant. There are no true specialized roots. We call them rhizoids. And there's no specialized vascular tissue. There are some sort of ancient or primitive vascular-like tissues called leptome and hydrome that can pump water and food product, the product of photosynthesis throughout the plant. But there are no real vascular structures in moss. Now, when we look at ferns, and by the way, moss first appeared, or there's evidence of primitive moss on this planet around 500 million, I'm saying approximately, around 500 million years ago. But then shortly after that, around between 450 million years, we start to see some of the ferns and fern allies. These plants that have vascular tissues, xylem that moves the water throughout the plant, and phloem that moves the sugar product, the product of photosynthesis throughout the plant. Ferns are a little more structured. We can look at a fern leaf. The fern leaf is called a frond. This now represents the sporophyte. So we've come a ways with the ferns. They're more adapted to a terrestrial life cycle. They're still, you tend to find ferns in more moist, humid regions, especially the tropics. But this fern frond, this fern leaf, and the entire fern itself represents the sporophyte. With moss, the sporophyte was a single non-branching stalk with the spore-producing body at the tip. But with a fern, we have a much larger sporophyte with more diversification within the plant. We have branching patterns, and on the backside of many of these fronds or fern leaves, you find sori. That's where the spore-producing bodies are. So literally there could be thousands and thousands and thousands of sori clustered underneath the underside of these little fronds. And so now your sporophyte has become much larger, it's branching, and we produce multiple spore-producing bodies. Same type of life history. However, the gametophyte with a vascular plant like this, seedless vascular plant like this fern, the gametophyte is highly reduced. And the gametophyte with most ferns, there's just a small exception, just a small group. The gametophyte with the ferns is a homothallic or a bisexual gametophyte, and where both male and female parts are produced on that same very small, almost microscopic gametophyte. But you can look at the life history of the fern life cycle or life history and see a very similar pattern with the ferns when you compare those to the mosses or the non-vascular plants. However, you see that now the sporophyte is much larger and the gametophyte is highly reduced. Now, with the gymnosperms, there's a lot of different examples of gymnosperms. The conifers represent the biggest group, but there are other gymnosperms such as ginkgos. Ginkgos look a whole lot like a broadleaf, the flowering broadleaf trees, but they're a gymnosperm. But the most common gymnosperm are these pine trees, and we find these all over the southeast. This is a white pine here. Now this is the sporophyte, and now the sporophyte is huge. You know, think about sequoias and redwoods, those kinds of things. Those sporophytes, you know, are hundreds and hundreds of feet tall. It's come a long way from the little you know, non-branching stalk of a non-vascular plant, a moss. So now the sporophytes are much bigger. We see secondary growth. You know, you see woody growth in many of the gymnosperms, and the sporophyte is much taller, so you have secondary woody growth now. The vascular tissue is even more developed, and we see that the sporophyte has become just completely dominant with the seed-producing vascular plants, the gymnosperms. Now, reproduction has changed a little bit. We have female cones such as this, where the female reproductive structures are produced. The male cones, I don't have an example, but you can sort of picture it. Just a month or so ago, we had, well, a couple months maybe, we had the male cones producing massive amounts of pollen. Well, those male cones produce spores that germinate inside those cones. As they germinate, they develop into pollen grains. That's the male gametophyte. It's only a few cells big, but that's a gametophyte, highly reduced. Those male gametophytes then are wind released, and they pollinate female cones that are held onto the sporophyte for quite some time. Pollination occurs, and eventually fertilization occurs. Pollination is just the transfer of the pollen grains to the female cone. But then pollen tubes literally develop out of those small pollen grains, and the sperm travel down those pollen tubes to fertilize the eggs that are contained in ovules within the base of each one of these little bracts. And that's where the female gametophytes are contained. That's where the seeds develop. So reproduction is somewhat, or it is contained, the process is contained inside this female cone. Those eggs are fertilized, become little zygotes and develop into an embryo, and then develop into the seed, or the actual embryo sac develops into the seed that surrounds that developed embryo. The seeds are contained inside this female cone here. So still a same pattern. It's still an alternation of generations. That seed, of course, would develop into a sporophyte. A lot of reproductive survival value in this, because this pine cone can lay around on a forest floor for decades and the seeds are still viable. And so there's a lot of survival value in that. And also it's a different mechanism of reproduction, in that the male gametophyte now flies through the wind to fertilize a female cone, or to pollinate a female cone and eventually fertilize the eggs inside here. So that's an example of a gymnosperm, still a very, you can still see this same pattern, still same type of life history, but players are different. With the flowering plants, there's all kinds of flowering plants. Flowering plants are the gymnosperms depending on the area, but the flowering plants are highly successful. And everything you see behind me, all the various trees, the tulip poplars, the maples, the oaks that are down here, all of these trees are flowering plants. Now, they exhibit secondary growth, but there's many flowering plants such as this, and this little aster here, that just exhibit primary growth or herbaceous growth. The flowering plant is a highly successful plant. The reproductive strategy is very similar. Flowering plants either occur on a tree or a herbaceous plant as a bisexual flower, or the flowers can be produced independently on the same plant or on different plants. But the point is, there are specialized floral parts, male floral parts, the stamen that's divided into a filament and an anther, and a female reproductive structure called the carpel or pistil that's divided into a stigmastyle and ovary. It's within that ovary that the ovules are contained, that contain the female embryo sacs where the eggs are contained. It's within the anther that the male pollen grains are produced. Those are the male gametophytes. And pollination occurs via many different mechanisms: wind, insects, birds, all kinds of different mechanisms for pollination to occur, unlike the wind-dependent pollination we see with most of the gymnosperms. So that was very, very quickly a run through, all the major groups, from the non-vascular plants to the primitive vascular plants, the seedless vascular plants, the ferns, to the seed-producing vascular plants, the gymnosperms, and finally the angiosperms, the flowering plants. And another one thing, flowering plants are so specialized, they also produce a ton of different types of fruit. Behind me or beside me here is a maple tree, and you don't always think about these as fruits, but all these achenes here, these are a dry type of fruit that falls from the tree. They kind of migrate away from the tree. They can float. They can do all kinds of beautiful things, right? But there are also various types of fruits that are soft fruits, fleshy fruits that provide food for all kinds of different animals. Berries for birds, or fleshy fruits and figs, and all those are fruits. And there's tons of different types of fruits and all kinds of different mechanisms of dispersal associated with the fruits that contain a single seed or multiple seeds that can be spread throughout the environment. And before we get into the animals, which will be upcoming in the upcoming module, you have to remember that as far as the terrestrial landscape, and even to some degree the aquatic landscape, plants really create a lot of habitat and a lot of structure in all the various biomes, from tropical rainforest to temperate forest to everything. So just keep that in mind as we get into the next group of organisms that we study.